Well, let me begin by calling to mind an experience that Chesterton had shortly after the start of the First World War in 1914. He was in his Beaconsfield study in England dictating a detective story. From a newsboy outside, he could hear of the tragic carnage on the Western Front in France. Suddenly he paused, and in a new voice he drew a deep draught of hope from the well of despair. And this is what he was heard to say: "If seeds in the black earth can turn into such beautiful roses, what might not the heart of man become in its long journey towards the stars?" Now, for me, this story and that statement has always captured the visionary quality of Chesterton's mind, and the essential reason, I think, that he showed such profound understanding and such prophetic insight, the insight of a prophet. As the English scholar A.L. Maycock once pointed out, Chesterton had the rare power of intuition, which the Bible calls the gift of wisdom. This is a supernatural gift, the fruit of grace, not simply the outcome of reason. It gives an immediate glimpse of truth that outstrips reason, transcending it without denying or defying it. It comes like a sudden blaze of light, as Maycock put it, and with a quality of revelation. Chesterton had more than intellectual sparkle. He had spiritual insight. He had the capacity to penetrate reality and perceive the inner truth, not just the observable fact. I think this endowed him with the insight of a prophet. Now, the title of this paper, The Prophecies of G.K. Chesterton Revisited, might suggest a power to foretell future events, as if Chesterton was some kind of fortune teller, some astrologist. I'm not using prophecies in that sense, but rather as a way of highlighting his power of vision, spiritual and intellectual vision, and his singular gift for discerning the trends and movements of his time and anticipating their likely outcome in our time. He was, I think, a natural prophet and a supernatural one as well. And it's in this sense that I'd like to revisit the prophecies that he made in several areas, in particular those of human reasoning, economic organisation, and sexual freedom. As Dale Orquist has put it very nicely, 100 years before the fact, Chesterton tells us what's going on right now. Now, Chesterton himself had no pretensions to prophecy. He was a practising journalist, concerned with the passing problems of the day, subject to very demanding deadlines. He did not cherish any false notion of artistic immortality. As he once said, "There is no nobler fate than to be forgotten as the foe of a forgotten heresy, and no better success than to become superfluous." And yet, reflecting on this year as marking the 150th anniversary of his birth and approaching, as I mentioned earlier, the 90th anniversary of his death, it's striking there'd be few figures who could be judged less forgotten or less superfluous to our time than G.K. Chesterton. His journalism, which seemed so ephemeral, has proven to be remarkably enduring. He is, I think, the supreme exemplar of T.S. Eliot's definition of the Christian journalist, that he found the topical excuse for writing about the permanent. Well, let me turn now to a number of Chesterton's specific prophecies. Perhaps his greatest one was his early understanding of the mind of Western culture and what was happening to erode it, so that the ramifications would be far-reaching, flowing over into our institutions and our laws, our education, our politics, our personal relationships. Chesterton recognised at an early stage the roots of the philosophical nihilism that has now become so pervasive. The sense of nothingness that our culture tries desperately to answer with distractions. The emptiness it desperately tries to fill, but which sadly it now lacks the spiritual resources to do. He saw that the movement of ultimate doubt and denial would finally be suicidal, that reason would have no more questions to ask once it had questioned itself. Ultimate doubt dries up the human capacity for belief while stimulating, curiously, every form of credulity. As he is so often quoted, and it sounds so Chestertonian, even if the exact words have never been traced in his writings, when a man ceases to believe in God, he does not believe in nothing. He believes in anything. And yet in Chesterton's mind, the special mark of modern society was not that it was sceptical, but that it was dogmatic without knowing it. When on one occasion, a well-known novelist of the time, Arnold Bennett, accused Chesterton of being dogmatic, Chesterton replied that there are only two kinds of people in the world: those who accept dogmas and know it, and those who accept dogmas and don't know it. And the only advantage, he said, he enjoyed over the celebrated novelist, Arnold Bennett, was that he belonged to the former class of accepting dogmas and knowing it. Our own culture would balk at the idea that it is dogmatic without knowing it. It tends to prize itself on being sceptical and not at all prone to unconscious and often unrecognised dogmas. An unconscious dogma, Chesterton once wrote, is the definition of a prejudice. And prejudices have now replaced convictions as the currency of discourse in Western culture. Chesterton argued the problem for modern man is not that he has lost his way. Man has always lost his way, Chesterton said. The problem now is that he's lost his address. If we survey the history of the past century, we see the lost addresses being pursued by, say, the brutal power of communism and of Nazism in the 20th century, and by the corrosive power of wokery in the 21st century. They've all sought to fill the void left by Chesterton's lost address, the loss of one's true home. In the main, these dogmas have been utopian enthusiasms of various kinds, a craving for an unreal perfection in this world, whether political, like Nazism and communism, or broadly cultural, such as wokery. In practice, these ideologies have proved to be not liberating, but profoundly totalitarian in their thrust. They destroy freedom in the name of freedom and destroy ideals in the name of idealism. They advance their cause by the power of enforcement, political and legal, rather than the attraction of cultural authority and communal loyalty. In an age of political correctness, I think Chesterton would have been alive to the paradox that openness and tolerance, so-called, have come to be enforced selectively by the most narrowly minded and uninformed and the most intolerant. In the 1930s, he offered this criticism about fascism. He said that it appeals to an appetite for authority without very clearly giving the authority for the appetite. He saw all the difference in the world between power and authority. Between, on the one hand, the bullying power, including legalised bullying imposed by law, that allows the strong to oppress the weak. and on the other hand, the authority that's manifested in the inherent rightness of rule and untouchable transcendence of law, as these provide the basis of authority by contrast with power and the safeguard of universal human dignity. One of the most striking aspects of Chesterton's prophecy about the intellectual direction of our culture was his realisation, I think, that secular liberalism would inevitably end in nihilism. He saw at an early age the deep and fundamental opposition between modern liberalism as a movement and liberty as a quality to be preserved. He recognised that there was a profound, if not yet noticed, relationship between secular liberalism and totalitarianism. Secular liberalism had become a philosophy, not of liberty, but of licence, and it would in time license the loss of liberty. In fact, it's proving to be not really a philosophy or a system of beliefs at all. It's the absence of beliefs, the ultimate nihilism. It's not really a value, but a void, a fundamental emptiness, and it has led inevitably to desperate measures, often legally enforced, that produce the greatest void of all, the abyss of enslavement and extermination of human life. Chesterton always argued that the world needs a fixed spiritual standard, even for its own intellectual purposes. Unless we have some doctrine of a divine man, he said, all abuses may be excused, since evolution may turn them into uses. He admitted that he was very fond of revolutionists, but not very fond of nihilists. For nihilists, as their name implies, he said, have nothing to revolt about. T.S. Eliot had offered his own prophecy about secular liberalism in 1940, when he suggested that it was likely, as he put it, to prepare the way for that which is its own negation, the artificial, mechanised or brutalised control, which is a desperate remedy for its chaos. But several decades earlier, in 1905, in fact, Chesterton had offered an even more chillingly specific prophecy. This is what he said. The earnest free thinkers need not worry themselves so much about the persecutions of the past. Before the liberal idea is dead or triumphant, we shall see wars and persecutions, the like of which the world has never seen. The well-known journalist and broadcaster, Malcolm Muggeridge, that I quoted earlier, he recalled that at the time of this prophecy of Chesterton's, 1905, Joseph Stalin was a young man of 26. Hitler was a teenager, 10 years younger. They were, along with others, wrote Muggeridge, to make good Chesterton's words of prophecy to a terrifying degree. Again, touching on the destruction of the Western mind, the novelist Kingsley Amis singled out the Chesterton novel The Man Who Was Thursday as deserving of fresh appreciation for its prophetic insight. The book had been published in 1908, and Amos recalled reading it as a schoolboy. He came back to it some decades later, and he was amazed that the novel spoke even more urgently and resoundingly to his generation than to the one originally addressed by Chesterton. The Man Who Was Thursday has the subtitle of A Nightmare, and it reveals how exactly Chesterton discerned the shape of things to come, the final consequence of nihilism. He saw destructive forces in our society that would be nothing but destructive. They were not, he said, trying to alter things, but to annihilate them. They based themselves in the first place on an inner anarchy that denies all the moral distinctions on which Chesterton said mere rebels base themselves. Chesterton argued, I quote again, a purely intellectual conspiracy would soon threaten the very existence of civilization. The destruction of the future would come not from this commonly supposed seedbed of revolution, the lower classes who are so deprived, so socially and politically powerless, but rather from the educated and the affluent, those who have been cut off from their cultural roots, have lost contact with spiritual truth and moral wisdom, and who combine, in Chesterton's words, ignorance with intellectualism, and indulge in what he called a weak worship of intellect and force. The most dangerous criminal now, Chesterton wrote, is the entirely lawless modern philosopher. 1908. It underlined the critical importance of human thought in moulding the future, and it highlighted the destructive impact of the alienated mind. It portended, I think, the profound influence of the intelligentsia on such epoch-making events as the birth of Soviet communism in 1917 and the Nazi extermination programs of the 1930s and 1940s. Chesterton thought that our society had suffered a mental breakdown far more pervasive and complete than a moral breakdown, though the intellectual process prepared the way, prepared the ground for the moral change. An error, he said, is more menacing than a crime, for an error brings about crimes. At this very early time, Chesterton saw that a perverse alliance was forming in Western society between the rationalist outlook and the imaginative impulse, between reason and the imagination, both of which had become spiritually unanchored. He was certain, to quote his own words again, that the scientific and artistic worlds are silently bound in a crusade against the family and the state. Now, Kingsley Amis commented, by silently, Chesterton could hardly have meant more than secretly, Amis thought. But if by silently he had actually meant by an unspoken consensus, that is, the silent and pervasive power of what has later become political correctness, Chesterton would have been not just a remarkable prophet, Amos said, but a terrifying one. So let me quickly mention a second novel of Chesterton's that merits the accolade of being prophetic, and that is The Napoleon of Notting Hill. Its theme is economic and political rather than intellectual. It looks at the encroachments of a future totalitarian state. It was published in 1904 and is actually set 80 years ahead in the symbolically significant year of 1984. George Orwell, most famously associated, of course, with that year, 1984, title of his book, was only an infant when Chesterton's novel appeared in 1904. And his later adoption of 1984 as the title of his visionary novel may be no more than coincidence. We do know that Orwell admired Chesterton's prophetic qualities, though he was intensely irritated by what he saw as Chesterton's levity and his lopsided championing of Catholicism. The great threats to civilization had to be taken seriously and grimly, thought Orwell, and not in the jocular way that Chesterton apparently did quite often. Chesterton's playfulness may not have helped to secure his reputation as a prophet, for it can be readily mistaken for a lack of seriousness. After all, the Napoleon of Notting Hill opens with these words: "The human race, to which so many of my readers belong, has been playing at children's games from the beginning, and will probably do it till the end, which is a nuisance for the few people who grow up." And yet this sentence appears below the title of the first chapter, Introductory Remarks on the Art of Prophecy. So it's easy to see how a superficial or unsympathetic reading of Chesterton would lead to the conclusion that he was incurably frivolous. But below the foam and the froth lies an ocean of depth. He understood the key difference between being serious and being serious-minded. He said that funny is not the opposite of serious. Funny is the opposite of not funny, and of nothing else. Chesterton shared Bernard Shaw's view, I think, that, as Shaw is reputed to have said, if you're going to tell people the truth, you had better make them laugh, or they'll kill you. Now, the key theme of the Napoleon of Notting Hill is the menace to human liberty posed by the over-organisation of society and the growth of large impersonal units. This is now such a familiar criticism of modern society that it's easy to underrate the visionary understanding shown by Chesterton at the very beginning of the 20th century. But in 1904, it was not at all clear that the development of massive social corporations, large units of production and distribution, large bureaucracies, large cities, etc., could lead to a profound loss of personal freedom and responsibility and a vast array of social problems. Chesterton was among the first to recognise the stifling of human personality in the mass state, and he inspired various social thinkers such as E.F. Schumacher, the author of the best-selling book Small is Beautiful. In the face of what he saw more than a century ago as the trend towards totalitarian conformity, Chesterton proposed the solution of small and elementary units as what we might call the cells of human happiness. For his earliest years, as he says in his autobiography, he was much more attracted by the microscope than the telescope. He wanted to understand reality in all its teeming tangibility, all the life he could touch and feel, rather than as part of a contrived intimacy. He wanted to understand it through the microscope rather than the telescope. In the Napoleon of Notting Hill, he prophesied the revival as what has been called suburban patriotism. That is, the resurgence of neighbourhood, friendships and loyalties, which would satisfy the spiritual longings of ordinary people by providing a cause or object sufficiently small, sufficiently real, for them to comprehend and to cherish. His love of small and tangible structures had a seminal influence on the development of his social and economic philosophy of distributism. Distributism is not a great word, in fact, to the point where Dale has been leading a great effort to rename it as localism, since it's liable to misunderstanding or what is distributism about at all. Localism is more self-explanatory. But anyhow, it emerged as an alternative to the two main systems, capitalism and socialism, and involved the principle, as many of you would be quite aware of a wide distribution of property and ownership as a necessary condition of economic freedom, which then extended to other freedoms, religious and social and political. In his inimitable way, Chesterton pointed out that the problem with capitalism was that the ordinary person, instead of minding his own business, was minding somebody else's. And the socialist solution was no solution at all. Far from decentralising power, it merely concentrated it in a new form, creating bureaucrats where there were formerly capitalists. Chesterton was a lifelong liberal, with a capital L, in the older 19th century sense of the term. he harboured a deep distrust of the state and of bureaucracy as the instrument of the state. He saw this as part of the organised injustice of society. If people were unjust and cruel when they had the advantage of economic power, as they did under capitalism, how much more unjust and cruel could they be under socialism when they had the additional advantage conferred by political and legal power? Most of the influential social thinkers of Chesterton's day, such as those we've mentioned, George Bernard Shaw and H.G. Wells, were committed socialists. But Chesterton believed that they lacked any deep affinity with their fellow citizens. They didn't resort to Hillary Clinton's description of a basket of deplorables, but as is still the case, they harbour a deep suspicion and distaste of ordinary people. Chesterton thought they criticised human nature as if they themselves did not possess it. You left, he said, certain human needs out of your books. You may leave them out of your republic. His literary career began at the close of the Victorian age, when Queen Victoria died in 1901. A long era had unquestionably ended, and a new one was waiting to be explored and defined. Probably in no sphere would this process be carried out more ardently, and as we know in our time, more obsessively, than in that of sex. From the hypocrisy of the Victorian age that sex does not exist, the new age moved to the other extreme, that nothing else exists. We can certainly hear the early rumblings of the sexual revolution that's usually identified as starting in the 1960s and into our own time in the 21st century. But the process started much earlier. So let me just focus on a third example of Chesterton's prophetic insight and imagination relating this time to sexual freedom. In this early period, the assurance was that once sex were discussed openly and treated as natural, the society would be immensely and immeasurably healthier. No longer would we suffer repressions and frustrations. Sexual expression would constitute self-expression. And we would find in this a more complete means of self-fulfilment. Even in those early days, long before the 1960s, Chesterton queried whether this assumption represented the panacea it was thought to be. In his biography of St. Francis of Assisi, for example, published in 1923, he examined the Greco-Roman civilization that Francis had inherited. And he concluded that the nature worship promoted by the Roman Empire in its decline had actually ended in producing things decidedly against nature. As he wrote, thus the effect of treating sex as the only one innocent natural thing was that every other innocent natural thing became soaked and sodden with sex. For sex cannot be admitted to a mere equality among elementary emotions or experiences like eating and sleeping. The moment sex ceases to be a servant, it becomes a tyrant. Well, I think it's difficult amid the confused and jaded condition of our appetites today to deny the truth of that statement. In the Western world, sex has obviously become an obsession. It has swamped all of the expressions of our culture, our art, our literature, our songs, our dances, our movies, our entertainments, and so on. We've got used to having sex on the brain. And to quote Muggeridge again, this is, apart from many other considerations, as he put it, a most unseemly place to have it. Chesterton was acutely aware that sex cannot just be natural or bodily. It is also spiritual and supernatural. To deny this transcendental and sacramental dimension is not only to impoverish it, but finally to render it unnatural. It's to exalt sex at the expense of love. The sexual revolution of our time as it has become paradoxically clear, imposes limits on the enjoyment of sexual love by reducing it, as it were, to sexuality and separating it from all other aspects of our personal and social existence. It's now reached a new level, of course, where the sex of one's biology is colliding with the gender of one's choice, and the subjective experience of the individual is thought supreme, socially conditioned, and legally validated by redefinition. In 1926, several years after his biography of St Francis, Chesterton offered a striking prediction. The next great heresy, he said, is going to be simply an attack on morality, and especially on sexual morality. And it's coming not from a few socialists surviving from the Fabian Society, but from the living, exultant energy of the rich, resolved to enjoy themselves at last with neither papery nor Puritanism nor socialism to hold them back. The roots of the new heresy, God knows, said Chesterton, are as deep as nature itself, whose flower is the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eye and the pride of life. I say that a man who cannot see this cannot see the signs of the times, cannot see even the sky signs in the street that are the new sort of signs in heaven. The madness of tomorrow is not in Moscow, but much more in Manhattan. But most of what was in Broadway is already in Piccadilly. Back in 2006, the American author and journalist Dawn Eden, she more recently adopted the full name of Dawn Eden Goldstein in recognition of the Jewish identity of her birth, published a book called The Thrill of the Chaste, C-H-A-S-T-E, subtitled Finding Fulfillment While Keeping Your Clothes On. Her book describes how betrayed she felt by the sexual revolution of recent decades. After experiencing many years of casual sex with an uncountable number of partners, she came to regard it as a con and something that is far more destructive for women than for men. When Dawn Eden Goldstein is, why she's relevant, I think, to our conference today, is that a major reason for the return of balance and happiness in her life was G.K. Chesterton. She was well known as a writer on rock music, Dawn was, and one day she was interviewing a Los Angeles rock band leader, Ben Eschbach. Dawn asked him what he was reading, and he said, The Man Who Was Thursday by G.K. Chesterton. Curious, she searched for the book and was immediately captivated. Soon she was reading everything by Chesterton that she could get hold of, starting with Orthodoxy, in which she explained why he found the Christian faith so compelling. Now, this was the first time it had struck Dawn, who had been brought up in a liberal Jewish household, that there was something exciting and attractive about Christianity. She kept reading Chesterton, even as she continued her lifestyle of promiscuous dating. And then one night, in October 1999, she remembered, she had what is termed a hypnagogic experience, the sort which you're drifting off to sleep and entering the world of dreams. And she heard a woman's voice saying, some things are not meant to be known, some things are meant to be understood. She got on her knees and prayed. She became a Protestant Christian at first and eventually a Catholic. Now, in all my years of reading Chesterton, which started when my dad introduced me to him when I was an undergraduate in Sydney here in the 1960s, I've repeatedly come across stories like Dawn Eden's of people who have picked up a Chesterton book and been captivated. I remember when Dale, our special guest today, invited me to speak at the 2018 conference of the Chesterton Society in America. I was amazed at how many Catholic converts I kept meeting in the audience, excuse me, who attributed their conversion at least in a human sense, to Chesterton's influence. Dale, in fact, has edited a great book of such conversion stories, 34 of them, in fact. The book is called My Name is Lazarus, and it's with the books that Mark and Gay have available there with other titles of Dale's. If Chesterton had lived longer, what might he have prophesied about the particularities of our time and the likely course of various trends? It's probably a temptation we should resist, as it's risky to speculate about what Chesterton might have written. But I'm a weak man, so I'm going to succumb to the temptation today. I thought it might be worth finishing this paper with a line of speculation, as it might serve to show how Chesterton's most vital insights can shed light on developments that he could not have foreseen, but which we are now experiencing. I wonder, for example, what he might have thought about the emergence of artificial intelligence, AI as it's come to be called. This development seems destined to have a huge, pervasive impact on society in such areas as commerce and education and politics and so on. It so far provoked varied responses ranging from cautious excitement to suspicion and even outright alarm. Chesterton, of course, did not live to see the phenomenal rise of electronic technology, especially of the personal technology of the smartphone. The idea of Chesterton using a smartphone just blows the mind, really. It's just impossible to imagine. But it might be possible to offer some tentative, if admittedly unprovable, impressions of how he might have responded to this great change, and particularly artificial intelligence. Impressions that would be in harmony with his insights into human nature and into our spiritual and cultural life. I suggest he might have noted several things. One would be an economic insight, how the world of big tech has become a new system of concentrated power, similar to the systems of concentrated power in Chesterton's time, and still in ours, to which he responded by promoting the economic and social philosophy of distributism or localism. The spreading of ownership and power in society rather than there being concentrated or centralised. Big tech has now joined the two main systems of big business, characteristic of capitalism, and big government, characteristic of socialism, which Chesterton challenged, with big government being able to add political and legal and now electronic reinforcement and expansion to its economic power. In the case of big tech, Chesterton might have seen Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk as the leaders of what has been called the soft tyranny of the smartphone, compared with the harsher tyranny associated with the traditional concentrations of big business and big government. The second point that Chesterton might have made would capture the paradox of technology. This paradox is that while ingenuity enables human beings to create products of economic power, they soon find that these exceed their capacity, their moral and political capacity to control them. An early and ever-present example would be nuclear power. When it was first revealed in the atomic bombs detonated in 1945 at the close of World War II, the English priest author Ronald Knox wrote that it was as if when the first aeroplane was created, it had been a bomber. That is, not simply a vehicle of flight that allowed space to be rapidly traversed and often panoramic glimpses of the wonders of creation, but rather a menacing creation, an instrument of destruction and death. It's now come to be used for peaceful and beneficial purposes as a climate-friendly source of energy, even though the spectre of utter annihilation continues to haunt the world. Chesterton did write about technology and its potential dangers, though in his time, of course, it was assessed in the context of the Industrial Revolution, machines, rather than in our time, the electronic revolution, the computers. He acknowledged the benefits that machinery offered in terms of labour-saving devices and motorised transport, say, that they might, as he wrote in 1925, reduce the work imposed on each of us to a minimum. But he added it will also reduce our control to a minimum. From the beginning, he was concerned that we would, as he put it, ourselves become parts of a machine. So Chesterton was, and the machine, he said, would be our master. So Chesterton, he said that in 1925. So Chesterton was alive quite early to this great dilemma. Would we control the machines we invent, or would they come to control us? When we reckon with the intensely personal and thus far more intrusive nature of communications technology, the smartphone, social media, artificial intelligence, we realise that technology has this dual nature, that, as has been said, it has the face of a servant, but the heart of a tyrant. What at first appears as an instrument of freedom, of new and vastly expanded means of communication, can become an instrument of oppression, in fact of self-oppression, ushering in all kinds of personal and social maladies, including addiction and a reduced capacity for close friendships based on physical presence rather than screen images and sounds. And yet, if I may take a slight detour here, I think Chesterton, I just suspect, he might have found a certain enchantment in personal technology of the smartphone. One of the chapters in his book, The Outline of Sanity, is called The Romance of Machinery. As a journalist, he was always enlivened by the material and almost mystical qualities of a newspaper. He spoke rather poetically of the great lights, he said, burning on through darkness into dawn, and the roar of the printing wheels, weaving the destinies of another day. Chesterton was not a Luddite. He did not disdain machines, as can be assumed at times when critics think of distributism as everyone owning 3 acres and a cow. I think he was fascinated rather than frightened by machines. And anyhow, the idea of Chesterton sitting on a stool milking a cow is enough to break the imagination, apart from the stool. I've sometimes wondered if there's an instructive comparison here between Chesterton and a well-known guru of the electronic age, namely Steve Jobs. As the founder of Apple, Jobs had a phenomenal impact on the development of personal computing, creating such devices as the iPod, digital music, the iPhone, and the iPad. I think Chesterton and Jobs both felt a certain romance about technology. They saw it as an art and not just a science, which offered ways of enhancing human life rather than distorting or deadening it. While Steve Jobs had the rationality of the scientist, he also possessed the imagination of the artist. He was keen to make Apple products aesthetically appealing, a desire he attributed to a course in calligraphy, which he took as a young man. The course attuned him to the value of attractive typography, which he called beautiful, historical, artistically subtle, in a way that science can't capture. Jobs incorporated these features into the first Mac computer, and he invested it with different typefaces and even attended to the elegance of the packaging in which the computer was presented. As he once put it, technology alone is not enough. It's technology married with the liberal arts, married with the humanities, that yields the results that make our hearts sing. Both Chesterton and Jobs were acutely conscious of the human aspects of technology. They recognised the need for any business initiative, whether a farm or a computer, to be based on a broader view of commercial promise than mere practical performance. Any such venture should not be purely functional. It should not simply work. It should also address the full range of human needs and desires, such as being easy for ordinary people to use and not simply something for the expert. It should be beautiful as well as serviceable. It should promote goodness, not evil. Despite the vast size of Apple as a company, Jobs wanted the personal computer to be truly personal. He focused on pictures rather than words and laid down standards that are universally recognised and accepted. He described the computer not in abstract or mechanistic terms, but rather quaintly as a bicycle for our minds. He was adopted as a child, and while his biological mother was Catholic, his adoptive parents were Lutheran. But he rejected Christianity in his teenage years. It's been argued, most notably by the Italian writer Umberto Eco, author of Name of the Rose, that the rivalry between the two computing giants, Steve Jobs' Apple and Bill Gates' Microsoft, can be best explained in religious terms. Apple, argued Eco, Apple was Catholic. It relied on images and icons, akin to holy pictures, he said, and being accessible to everyone, not just to a technical elite. By comparison, he thought that Microsoft was Protestant, stressed the importance of the word and required special expertise and individual interpretation for success. I've sometimes wondered about the fascinating conversations that might have taken place, might now be taking place, between Chesterton and Jobs. I think it'd be full of the cross-fertilisation that each of them in their different fields exemplified. Well, apart from the great promise of technology, I've emphasised its dual nature, that it's liberating and yet at the same time potentially enslaving. And I think that when we consider artificial intelligence, the principle of supreme importance for Chesterton, which guided his judgment of social developments, evident in his other prophecies, would have been the principle of freedom. He recognised that freedom held an instinctive appeal, and the distributist idea of wide distribution of ownership answered that appeal. And he was also conscious of what we might call a psychological barrier to the embrace of freedom in a culture that has become used to, and is now even more used to, security and being risk averse, which, as we know, the exercise of freedom challenges. Big business, with its relentless advertising that converts wants into needs, and big government, with its pervasive provision of services and support systems, have both played a part in our attitude to freedom. Big business has stimulated a culture of rising expectations that are hard to dampen and control, and big government has entrenched these expectations. Has created a culture of entitlement, so that the availability of pensions and endless payments from the state is an unquestioned right, expected and guaranteed, and not just a powerful aspiration applied and paid for. In the early writings of distributists, not only of Chesterton but of Hilaire Belloc, I think there's a lurking fear that we have become so inured to the experience of security, of a condition of political and economic dependence, that we now tend to resolve the tension between security and liberty by giving up our liberty. We might find a certain reassurance in being safe, even if this means being servile. Well, if such fears are now even more real, Chesterton may well have seen that, as his comments about the machine and the industrial age suggest, the new technology of personal communication and artificial intelligence reinforces the paradox that while it offers the promise of extending our freedom, it can actually curb and control our freedom, even if we don't notice it or are not prepared to admit it. It presents the spectre of a new oppression. I suspect for Chesterton the very term artificial intelligence would have stirred his suspicion, as if intelligence could or should become artificial rather than real. I think he would have pondered what this might mean for the creativity and originality of human intelligence, and even its reliability, given the anonymous and untraceable nature of what AI can present to us, as well as the question of quality control in an electronic environment. It was Chesterton's surpassing achievement then, just to sum up, to have seen the signs of the times and to have grasped their significance. He recognised at such an early stage a number of key truths which we've just touched on today. One is he recognised the destructive influence of bad philosophy on the social order, and especially on the dignity of the human person, every human person, and the integrity of the family. Secondly, he was alive to the profound human need for intimate loyalties, for grassroots connections, for small and manageable structures in economic as well as social life, so that he shrank from the dehumanising consequences of bigness and the passing of control and responsibility to others at the cost of individual freedom. And finally, he saw the ruinous effects of sex when it became a detached and promiscuous appetite and no longer a creative and steadfast power. Well, he foresaw many other things as well that no time to cover in this paper, but I think they'll become clear throughout the day, and certainly in Dale's presentation after morning tea and the emergence of the Chesterton Schools movement. When Chesterton died in 1936, Monsignor Ronald Knox, preached the panegyric, and he observed that Chesterton, quote, will almost certainly be remembered as a prophet in an age of false prophets. His great gift, which is why we have come together today, I suspect, was to see reality in the light of eternity rather than of time. His vocation was like that of the prophets of the Old Testament. He came to serve as an interpreter and mouthpiece of God. And this means that his 150th birthday is not really an occasion to celebrate a writer from the past, or even a writer for the future who produced prophecies, but as a writer who transcended time. As the late English novelist Anthony Burgess once put it, solid and earthbound as he seemed, Chesterton knew what it was like to live on the level of eternity. Thank you very much, Steve. The wonderful Christian is providing our morning tea, so we'll break very, very shortly. But please, let's have questions. Steve, yes.
If I can ask a question. Firstly, I'll make a statement, and I think Karl, you've surpassed yourself. I think that's one of the best papers you have ever given. Certainly, I'm not trying to get more morning tea by the time.
Thank you, Steve.
Most of us have been, I suppose, transfixed by the American election. Do you think, how do you think Chesterton would have looked at it? Would he look at it with amusement, horror, a sense of folly? What do you think?
My goodness. I think our distinguished guest would be best to feel that question. You might like to chew on it over morning tea. But I'm sure, a mingling of emotions. He wrote 2 books on America, and he had a great affection for America. And I think, as has been often quoted, he thought that it was a nation with the soul of a church. So I think, there was so much of what happened in the political sphere was kind of a, divine dress rehearsal, as it were. It's curious, though, that it seems to me, anyhow, Dale can correct me, that as America far more originally and ingrainedly religious than, say, Australia, which is virtually a secular and secularist society from the outset, has certainly become more secular and, of course, less interesting as a result, and more inclined to engage in the banal rather than deal with anything of great and transcendental significance. So, you know, when it comes to discussing issues of policy, well, you know, you sort of wait in vain to hear any discussions of anything. It's, you know, rhetoric is very high, all the lines that have been written for the candidates to recite. So you know, compared to other presidential elections I can recall, this is a far more secularised culture that's produced the election in a way that we're used to, where, you know, for the most part, trivia tends to prevail rather than any serious discussion of the nature of our culture and the direction it might be led towards. So that's just off the top of the head, Stephen. But we probably have time for one more question before we break. Yes, Karl? Yeah.
Thank you very much, Karl, for your talk. I just had one question. In light of his proposals for localism and his general distrust of certainly at least partly centralised authority, what do you think? What was his opinion on monarchy as a system?
Yes, that is a good question, and I think that he what he really appreciated about the monarchy, even if, you know, particular monarchs may not have appealed to him, that could be true of any of us, but the institution itself was a transcendental institution that embodied authority, not just power. And in fact, even as the power, I suppose, in the modern monarchy has declined, obviously, having an authority that is distinguishable from the political arena, even though it intersects with that, at least is the embodiment of a principle that, you know, Chesterton was, I think, touching on again and again when it comes to freedom, that if you don't have some source and summit, as it were, of authority in the culture, then it's almost inevitable you'll be dominated by contests of power alone, naked power, and it will be pervasive in its effects. So, you know, there was at least that institution that was you know, elevated above it and gave the people some hope. Now, all the surroundings of that, all of the trappings, of course, are important in many ways too, but I think he probably would have emphasised the principle of authority, transcendental authority, being embodied in an institution that was not subject to the simple contesting of power. Well, I think we probably should break, ladies and gentlemen. At the end of the day, we will have a panel session with the speakers, and there'll be an hour there for those of you who might have had questions or think of them during the day that you might like to raise. So thank you so much for your attention, and let's break for morning tea. We'll come back at 11:15 for Dale's paper. Thank you.